Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a pretty well-known tragedy today, the Eastland disaster back in 1915 Chicago. But we're going to be going beyond the headlines, looking at some of the less-known stories of, well, everyday heroes, folks like J.A. Rusk and Robert Snyder. Heard of them?
I have to admit, those names aren't exactly household names.
Right. That's kind of the point of today's deep dive. And to get there, we're going to be using excerpts from this super interesting podcast called Flower in the River.
I'm familiar with that one.
Yeah. And they take on the Eastland disaster, not just from the historical side, but the host also brings in her family history, even some kind of spoopy stuff. So buckle up.
Adding that personal element can really bring history to life.
Totally. Okay, so for those who might not remember all the details, the SS Eastland, it was a passenger ship docked in the Chicago River. They were getting ready to take a bunch of employees from the Western Electric Company on their company picnic.
A company picnic that turned into a horrific tragedy.
Yeah. And you'd think, docked in the river, what could go wrong? But the Eastland, it was known to be top-heavy, and it capsized just like that in minutes. Hundreds tracked below deck. Over 800 people died that day.
And all this happening right there in the river. Families watching from the shore as this disaster unfolded.
Just awful. But even amidst all that chaos and tragedy, there were some incredible acts of courage and just selflessness. One of those gotta-be-told stories is about J.A. Rusk. He had a produce business right by where the ship went down.
Wow. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Exactly. But instead of, getting out of there, he and his employees, they jumped right in, pulling survivors from the water, giving first aid, even turning his store into a temporary morgue.
That must have been, could you imagine?
It's hard to even comprehend, and what's even crazier is that we only know about him because of his obituary. It was decades later, 1943.
Wow, really?
Yeah, in the Oak Park Leaves. Just a short mention, calling him a colorful figure and a quiet hero. It's kind of mind-blowing, right?
Makes you wonder how many other heroes from that day their stories were never told.
Right. And that's why we do what we do. Another one of those gotta-be-heard voices is Robert Snyder's. And unlike Rusk, we actually have Robert's own words. An account he gave to the Grand Forks Daily Herald just a few days after the disaster. Really powerful stuff.
A first-hand account like that, it's like a window into the past.
Totally. And Robert, he wasn't alone on the Eastland. He was there with his sweetheart, Bessie Straan.
Adds a whole other layer to his story, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. This 19-year-old guy, a machinist apprentice, out with his girl, and suddenly they're thrown into the water. Chaos everywhere.
Can't even imagine what was going through their minds.
And here's the thing, Robert. He not only survived, he managed to save Bessie and 4 other women, too.
He's like a real-life hero.
Seriously. He talks about using a floating board, a hose, anything he could find to help them climb out, the whole time exhausted, scared. And he actually tried to find another friend of his, Martha Strachey, but she disappeared under the ship.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. He even talks about this moment where he had to choose between 2 women who were both drowning, who's only able to save one. Just heartbreaking.
Choices like that made in those kinds of moments, wow.
Yeah. The impact of that day on individual lives, it's just...
Man.
We can talk about the big picture, but these stories are so important.
It's amazing how their story, Robert and Bessie's, it starts with this tragedy, but it really becomes part of Chicago's story. Like the city's growth, the immigrants, that whole working class vibe.
Yeah, their lives kind of mirror what was happening in Chicago at that time.
And speaking of, let's talk about Robert's work at International Harvester. This wasn't just some small-time gig. They were huge, making all that farm equipment, helping feed the country. Their McCormick Works factory, it was right in a neighborhood called Back of the Yards, because of the stockyards, of course.
Yeah.
Thousands of workers.
Back of the Yards. Now, that was a place and a time, right? All those different cultures, mostly immigrants from Eastern Europe, trying to make a better life. I can only imagine what it was like. The energy, the noise, the smells. But it was more than just work, though, right? Back of the Yards had this strong sense of community, everyone looking out for each other.
And they had their share of struggles, too. International Harvester, they were in the middle of these big labor battles, workers fighting for better pay, safer conditions. It was a tough time.
I wonder if Robert, after living through the Eastland, if that made him even more aware of those struggles. Like life is precious, people deserve to be treated fairly.
Yeah. Could be. And those labor movements, even though they caused a lot of disruption, they actually led to some big changes, like 8-hour workday. So in a way, Robert's part of that story of progress, too.
Definitely. And as we follow along, Robert and Bessie, they're figuring things out in this changing world. By 1920, they had a son, Robert Jr., and they're living right there in Back of the Yards.
Living in Back of the Yards, it wasn't just where you lived, it was like you were part of something. And Bessie, remember, she lost her younger sister Grace on the Eastland. So being surrounded by other immigrant families, people who understood what they were going through, must have helped.
Right. Even after tragedy, life goes on. And Robert and Bessie, they were focused on family, building a good life for their kids.
And they kept making changes. By 1930, Robert had left International Harvester, started working for the railroad. Maybe he's looking for something steadier, you know?
Yeah, you gotta wonder, why the switch? Was it money, or maybe he wanted a job that wasn't so hard on his body, especially after, everything that happened on the Eastland?
We can only guess, but they were definitely determined to make things work. And they had a daughter by then, Julie. So their family's growing, their needs are changing.
And the changes kept coming. 1944, they moved to Morgan Park on the southwest side. This wasn't just moving down the street, it was like moving up in the world. More like the suburbs,
Right. Yeah, it sounds like they did pretty well for themselves. A lot of immigrant families back then, that was the goal, to give their kids a better life. Morgan Park, it was a step up from Back of the Yards for sure.
But that same year, 1944, Bessie passes away.
Oh, that's sad. Life could be so unpredictable.
Yeah. And it's especially tough because Robert's son, Robert Jr., he's off fighting in World War II, and their daughter, Julie, she's married with a kid of her own. So Robert, he's all alone now.
He went through so much, the Eastland losing Bessie.
But he kept going. He actually moved to Tacoma, Washington later on. Lived out the rest of his life there.
Tacoma, that's a big move. Maybe he wanted a fresh start, after all that loss. Or maybe something was drawing him out west. Family, maybe. Or just the beauty of the place.
Whatever the reason, it shows he wasn't afraid of change, even as he got older. And when he died in 1967, he was 71, they brought him back to Chicago to be buried.
Back to where it all began, right? Meeting Bessie the Eastland. It's like he came full circle.
And it's through his story in J.A. Rusk's that we really see the impact of the Eastland, Not just names on a list, but real people with hopes and dreams and families, people whose lives were changed forever.
Exactly. Their stories show us that history isn't just about big events. It's about the people who lived through them.
Yeah.
How those events changed them and how they changed the world.
But there's one more piece of this puzzle, something a little different. Remember we mentioned that podcast, Flower in the River, and the host's connection to the Eastland?
Oh yeah, things are going to get a bit spooky now, right?
Get ready for some chills. See, the host, Natalie Zett, her great aunt, was on the Eastland. And Natalie's family, they say they experienced some strange things in the years after the disaster. Weird noises, things moving around, even seeing ghosts.
Ooh, that's creepy. But maybe it shows how trauma can stick with people, even generations later.
Yeah, some things we just can't explain. And sometimes those unexplained things, they're connected to these big historical events, and it makes everything even more complicated, Makes you think.
It's wild, right? We started with this terrible tragedy, but we ended up talking about personal stories, even some spooky stuff. History's like that, I guess.
And
full of surprises.
And sometimes those spooky parts, those mysteries, those are the ones that really stick with you. But even with all that, we can't forget about the real people at the heart of it all, like Rusk and Robert and Bessie.
Totally. Their stories show us how strong people can be. They went through so much, losing loved ones, dealing with all those changes, and they still found a way to live meaningful lives. They left their mark on Chicago.
And by looking at their stories, we understand the bigger picture even better. The Eastland disaster, it was awful, but it also shows us how strong communities can be, how people help each other, how we keep trying to build a better future no matter what.
Like J.A. Rusk, right? Turning his store into a place for the victims. He didn't ask for anything in return, he just helped. A true unsung hero. His actions made a difference for so many people who were hurting.
And Robert, surviving that nightmare, saving Bessie and those other women, when you read his words, it's like you're right there with him, feeling the fear, the chaos, seeing those acts of bravery.
His story reminds us that history is not just dates and facts in a textbook. It's about real people, their emotions, their experiences. It's about love and loss and how we pick ourselves up and keep going.
And Bessie, we might not have her words written down, but she's definitely part of Robert's story. They fell in love, built a life together in a city that was constantly changing. It's a story about how important it is to connect with each other, to find strength in each other, especially when things are tough.
And her story and her sisters, they show us the impact the Eastland had on families, especially immigrant families in Chicago. It's easy to forget that behind the numbers, there are real people who lost so much, who had to rebuild their lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we hope you've learned something new about the Eastland disaster, but also that you've gained a new appreciation for the power of individual stories. J.A. Rusk, Robert and Bessie, Natalie's great-aunt, and all those others whose stories we might never know. They all help us understand this tragedy and how it shaped the world.
Maybe their stories will make you want to explore your own family history. See what hidden stories you can find. You might be surprised at what you discover. The strength, the courage, the unexpected connections.
So keep digging, keep asking questions. Remember, history isn't just something we read about, it's a part of who we are. It shapes how we see the world.
And who knows, you might even stumble across some mysteries along the way. Like we saw today, sometimes the most interesting parts of history are the ones we can't quite explain. They keep us curious, wanting to learn more.
Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, stay curious and keep an open mind. History's full of amazing stories waiting to be discovered.